Welcome back to the Jessica Ash Wellness YouTube channel, coming to you with another episode of the Fully Nourished Podcast, a place where we explore how female physiology and feminine energy dance together to shape our life experience. I'm Jessica Ash, a functional nutritionist and integrative health coach, and in this podcast, you can expect both a scientific and spiritual approach to female physiology, bioenergetics, hormones, biology, behavior change, and the female experience. You'll see how your health struggles and burnout are initiating you as a woman into a journey of deep nourishment and fulfillment. With that being said, as a reminder, everything in this podcast is set for education and inspiration only and is not intended as medical advice. Please talk to the appropriate professional if necessary, and please use common sense before making any changes to your diet or lifestyle. So today was our live Q&A in the Fully Nourished community, and oh my gosh, I always have so much fun with the gals. So many of the women in our community have been here for such a long time that we've gotten to know each other the weird way that you can online, and it's my ultimate goal to continue to foster the community and make it closer and closer, because I think that's what we as women want the most. Sure, the information's great. Sure, it's great to be empowered and educated, but also we just need connection with each other, and we all rely on it so deeply. And we specifically were talking a little bit about blood sugar and insulin resistance, and I was like, hey, that's actually the podcast episode I'm going to record today, so I'll do a deep dive, but this is inspired by you ladies who you are. So yes, we're going to talk about blood sugar today, insulin resistance. That's a common topic that everyone wants me to discuss, but we're going to do it in a way that you probably haven't heard before, or maybe you have heard a little bit of it before, but we're going to dive a little deeper. But our conversation today during the live, or I should say my conversation with myself, because I'm sitting there talking to a camera, very weird, was specifically talking about a certain product. I'm not going to mention the name of it, but it was just launched by a really popular influencer in the continuous glucose monitor, blood sugar monitoring, don't ever spike your blood sugar crowd. And it's fascinating to me because this is not new, but it's just rebranded. And I feel like branding and marketing has gotten better and better over the course of years. And so now we're not necessarily looking at something new, we're just looking at a new angle. But it got me thinking, or getting a little nostalgic, over my low carb and keto days, where all I could think about was sugar. I swear I spent so much time and energy during my day dreaming about desserts, dreaming about sweets, trying to figure out ways to healthify or low sugarify treats. And that was at a time when things like Swerve and erythritol and stuff like that was not really that popular. So it was very difficult to find, more expensive. And so your only option was really like stevia. And it was like the very basic, rudimentary, primal forms of stevia, not the ones that exist today. And I was trying to think about what's the worst health abomination I ever made, or I should say like non-sugar abomination, faux dessert, whatever we want to call it, that I had ever made. And I can think of two equally grotesque non-sugar abomination desserts, because these were sad, sorry excuses for dessert. One was this Neapolitan ice cream, heavy quotation marks around it again, because I took frozen cauliflower, like the frozen riced cauliflower, and I went out of my way to purchase 3 different types of protein powders: a vanilla, a strawberry, and a chocolate. Maybe I already had the chocolate, but 3 different types. And I blended the cauliflower with almond milk and protein powder and did it like a Neapolitan ice cream, where I did the chocolate and then I froze it, and then I did the strawberry and then I froze it, and then I did the vanilla and I froze it. And I'm just like, girl, you could have just had a little bit of raw honey. Girl, you could have just had some fruit. Girl, you could have just had some potatoes. But no, you spent hours creating this abomination. Another one that was so bad was, it was like all the rage to do both like low calorie and low carb. And so it was like a similar situation, base cauliflower, duh, and base almond milk, unsweetened, duh. And I added protein powder, and then I added xanthan gum because you wanted that thick texture. And then I had to go to many different grocery stores to find butter extract because I was trying to make a cake batter flavored like milkshake because girl, I was craving dairy like no one's business. But no, I had to make this disgusting abomination of cake batter flavored throat coating mush. If you have ever thickened something with xanthan gum, oh my gosh. Just thinking about it is disgusting. But I've done a lot of that kind of stuff in my life. I think about all the times that I ate butter bombs when I was keto. Oh, just straight butter bombs. Oof, ooh, my poor gut. And of course, I was convinced that I was a sugar addict because I wasn't consuming any sugar. And so, of course, it's all my body wanted me to consume. And I feel like when you're in that state of undernourishment where you're just like so severely underfueled, you crave things that you wouldn't even normally want to eat. You binge on things that are not even good. But it's just your body is craving energy so badly, and specifically carbohydrate, glucose, quick firing energy that only glucose can provide. And also, if you're severely under eating, especially if you're really active, of course you're going to crave sugar if you're not consuming it. Cravings are really instinctual. And we're so far from our biological instincts right now as just a population, but especially if you're a part of dieting culture or just the health and wellness sphere as a whole. It's like a wild west out there. And as we talked about last week, most people view nutrition through the lens of sacrifice, right? We haven't shaken that yet. We haven't shaken the idea that like we're not inherently wrong for just being who we are, that our bodies are not out to get us and bad and inherently evil and up to no good. I think at the core of it, when you have a long history of people who believe that deep, deep down, they are dirty, they are wrong, they are sinners. There's something wrong with your base instincts, right? Like deep down inside of yourself, you're a savage. And that's not only what you believe about yourself, but that's also what you believe the one who created you believes about you. It does something very dirty to your psyche. If your deepest core belief is that your body is wrong, everything around you is wrong, it's dirty, it's rotten, it doesn't function right, that's your reality. And man, one of the greatest gifts of life is the gift of free will to think what we want to think and believe what we want to believe. Isn't that right, baby? But oh, we sure do reap what we sow. And so truly the beginning of wisdom is to open up your mind to that maybe you're wrong, right? That maybe we're wrong about a lot of things. And maybe just because everybody else believes something doesn't necessarily make it just true. And one of the main things that I talk about often is how the diet culture and health and wellness industry is very parallel. It operates very similarly to the very dogmatic aspects of religion, especially like the Christian church. It reminds me so much of these very dogmatic religious circles, Protestant circles, evangelical circles, fundamental circles, so much. It's like everybody is just doing what everybody is doing. And there's this sick game of telephone where everyone's speaking this language and everyone's looking over there and saying, well, everyone's doing it this way and they're doing it this way and they're doing it this way. Everyone's talking about this, so it must be in the Bible or it must be true or it must be of Jesus. And you're like, where does it say any of that? None of it is based in any type of scripture or just basic common sense. And in the health and wellness world, a lot of times, none of it is based in any type of physiological process. There's no understanding of physiology because the health and wellness world now worships at the altar of the scientific study. And the problem with this is when you look at scientific studies apart from how physiology functions, it is a dark hole. You're pretty much it's similar to picking a verse out of the Bible out of context and saying, this verse says this. It would be like you pulling a verse out of Deuteronomy or Leviticus, and it's some random Levitical law. And you're like, it says in the Bible that I can have 7 wives because this guy has 7 wives. The scientific study is a way of people pulling whatever they want to prove their own bias. Now, I'm not saying that's all scientific research, you throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the lens that you view science through, science is simply our effort to try to understand the things that we cannot explain. And a lot of people have come to think that science is a god, that it is telling you what's true and what's not true, even if you can see before your very eyes that reality is one way and science tells you, no, it's this way. You say, oh, all hail the scientific study, all hail. And so now we cherry pick these scriptures, scientific studies, and we use them to stand on our platform and preach our message instead of looking at everything through the lens of wisdom of physiology that already exists. And ancient cultures did this. It's why so many of the ancient medicines, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, Unani medicine, South American medicine, Native American medicine, they all hit the nail on the heads. They had more knowledge and wisdom about the body than I really think that we do today. And it was much more instinctual. It was much more intuitive because healing and the body and physiology has always been known more of an art and an alchemy than it was a science. And now we've made it so analytical and logical and data driven that we've lost so much of the beauty and truly the knowledge, the wisdom, because the logic and the analytical brain can really only go so far. There's so much lost there. And this is why you always hear me bring up nuance so often, because the body, nourishment, healing, whatever you're doing is an art, and you're working with a living, dynamic thing. You're not working with a protocol. You're not working in a lab under fluorescent lighting in a controlled setting, right? And you have to recognize that, and that so much of what's always being utilized within the health and wellness space is very much based in the very best scientists that are truly trying to get the best results possible and truly answer the question that they're after. But even so, the way that science these days is structured, it's very hard for scientists to do that because most science has to be done in a lab, in a controlled setting, under a fluorescent lighting, in very unnatural settings. And science is not science anymore. Science used to be you observe things for a long period of time, you just sit there and you just observe for a long period of time. And over time, you would form a hypothesis. And then after you form the hypothesis, you then set out on the best way to prove your hypothesis. And now science is very much industry driven. And so you have the need for huge amounts of funding, and the ones that are doing the funding have an incentive to prove a specific point. So that's at the best, right? And then at the worst, you have just pure marketing where you have people kind of cherry picking little things here and there and forming their own kind of marketing spiel and then making you believe that it's science when really it's just pulled from a few studies and they've created a marketing spiel to just sell you on something. But no information is going to return you to the most important aspects of your health journey, which is returning to your instinct, returning to your insight, returning to your imagination, and returning to your intuition. This is what I call the 4 eyes of feminine enlightenment. because those are the things that we need to use in order to find what the next right step is for us. And until we return to those parts of ourselves, we don't need to develop them. We don't need to find them. They're already a part of us. We have just unlearned them. We have covered them up in layers of bullshit, and we have to get back to them or return to them. And so, going back to the idea that most people really view nutrition through the lens of scarcity, this lens of sacrifice and lack. They need something to fear and to demonize. There always has to be something to fear and to demonize, whether it be carbs or vegetables. That's a new one, right? The animal-based crowd fears vegetables because they used to be carnivore and fear carbs, but now they're like, oh, my body needs carbs. So now we need to do vegetables, the bad guy now. We even see this in the pro-metabolic space where it's PUFAs. It's all about the seed oils, right? As long as you just avoid the seed oils, you're going to be okay. And then people realize, oh, this didn't work out for me. If I just avoid seed oils and eat everything else, it doesn't work out for me. Oh no. So what's a new thing to fear, right? And we just keep going on this merry-go-round over and over and over and over again. Of course, there's a difference between that and actually removing foods that truly bother you to reduce irritation in the body and make the shifts that you need to get back to a place of equilibrium or balance where you can tolerate those foods again and you're cultivating a state of better and more robust health and better resilience. So over time, you can tolerate those foods. There's a big difference, of course. Again, nuance, right? But when we're talking about most people in the health and wellness space, it started out with a health issue and then it turned into something much bigger for them. The endless moving goalpost, because it starts out with just trying to get back to a place of vitality and vibrant health and quality of life, trying to return to who you are and return to yourself. And then it becomes about the perfect diet. And then it becomes about the perfect environment. And then the perfect supplements. And then the perfect products. And then the perfect life. And then the perfect image, perfect home, perfect mom, perfect. And then until eventually you're like, it's either start your own farm, grow your own food, live in a bubble, never enter society, find your own glacier water, or you're screwed, right? And the goalposts just never stop getting bigger and bigger and farther away. And so because carb demonization is really back in full force, it's always been here and there and everywhere, but it's really back in full force. A lot of people are convinced that they're addicted to sugar and their body doesn't need glucose because it makes it itself. And I find that this approach to all types of nutrients is flawed because if the body makes something, it goes out of its way to expend energy to make something and manufacture it, especially at the expense of something else. That seems pretty essential to me. If my body didn't need glucose, it just wouldn't make glucose and it would be fine without it. But no, my body goes through a process called gluconeogenesis when it's not getting enough fuel. It will literally break down its own tissue, its own muscle, gut, skin, any type of protein structure, send it to the liver, and then the liver will put all the other processes on the back burner. It's converting thyroid hormone, detoxifying estrogen and other hormones, all types of environmental toxins. Will put so much on the back burner so that it can turn that protein into sugar for me and release it into the bloodstream. I'd say glucose is pretty damn essential, but I don't know. It's just my opinion. And because we're in the midst of this anti-spike campaign as well, we have many layers to the glucose debate, but we also have now people who are telling you that if you are eating carbohydrates, your blood sugar should never spike. We want this blunted blood sugar response. We never want to see your sugar go up. You just want your blood sugar to be blunted constantly. And it's interesting because even one of my Fully Nourished students today in our live, Nikki, shout out to Nikki, she was sharing how as a diabetic, not having a blood sugar spike makes her feel worse. And I totally agreed. I said, hey, me too. If I don't see a rise in my blood sugar, I feel horrible because my body likes to use both fat in certain areas and glucose in certain areas. I have a very brain intensive job, so I'm burning through lots of quick firing fuel for my central nervous system and my brain. And I know that if I just tried to keep my blood sugar blunted all the time and prevent every increase in blood sugar from happening, that I would feel horrible, grouchy, and moody. Because I'm going to let you in on a little secret. When you eat something that contains carbohydrate, it is meant to be digested, absorbed into the bloodstream, and as it is absorbed into the bloodstream, you will see a rise in glucose. And as it steadily rises, then you will start to see a slow becomes a peak. And then as your cells uptake glucose and utilize it as fuel, because they do that, you'll start to see the blood glucose return back to a kind of this baseline. Blood sugar is dynamic. We're living creatures. Very rarely is something inside of us static and meant to be blunted. Now, of course, when we're having these erratic blood sugar spikes where you will eat something and we skyrocket sky high and it's just like boom and then drop back down rapidly, that is where it starts to become a problem. But you can see how trying to just blunt that glucose response and saying, my blood glucose is spiking, so I'm just going to blunt that spike, is not really doing anything but just manipulating the body to not do something that it's trying to do. And instead of asking the right question, which is, why is my body doing this? It's just, how do I fix this? And if you've been around a long time, I say this very often is, the question is rarely, how do I do this? And the question that usually helps us to actually resolve things is, why is this happening in the first place? And that takes us down a path, right? There's not one simple answer, but the answer to why is this happening in the first place is not, well, it's because you're not taking this supplement, or, well, it's because you're not eating your meals in the correct order, or it's because you're not having apple cider vinegar in front of a meal. Of course, those things can help. Those things can be really great, what I call bridges, to help us almost act as like stepping stones to get us to where we're trying to go. It's not bad to utilize tools and tips. But if we think that those are fixing our problem, that's where we start to go astray. And when they stop fixing our problem, because the body starts speaking up in other ways, we all of a sudden think, oh my gosh, I'm broken. How do I fix myself? Oh my gosh, I'm broken again. I'm always just broken. And it's, no, you're just not listening and you're not asking the right questions. And so when we are exploring blood sugar imbalances and therefore the deeper question of, is there actually insulin resistance involved? Because I've seen people that have severe blood sugar spikes and have great insulin levels, great insulin sensitivity. Even their leptin seems to be fine. There's obviously more to the story. I've also seen people that have completely normal blood glucose and severe insulin resistance, severe leptin resistance. And it doesn't always go hand in hand. Blood sugar irregularities or dysregulation and insulin resistance are often found together, but they're not always found together. And so it's important to kind of pinpoint what's actually going on. And I think a lot of people who start to use continuous glucose monitors, they start to say, oh my gosh, I'm insulin resistant because their blood sugar is spiking. The first thing that you would need to confirm is go take like a fasting insulin test, and don't forget to check your leptin, because leptin resistance often comes before insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is rarely a cause and is oftentimes an effect of something else. And you never just want to look at blood sugar and insulin in a vacuum, because rarely does it help you. You can do all these tricks to help with regulation, but it's not going to fix what's driving it. And it doesn't help that when you start to look for answers, all you find is people that are just like, carb bad, carb bad. I feel better eating carbs, carb bad, sugar addict, carb bad. And it's just, this echo chamber of, you might feel in your gut that there's something more to the story, but everyone's trying to convince you otherwise. And I've been there. Gosh, I spent so many years wasted. At my most active time in my life, and at the time where I thought I was eating the most healthy, it was very low carb. There was a period where I was pretty typical animal based before it was cool. Not as much carbohydrates though, definitely lower carbohydrate was more of the vegetables. I've talked about my journey before. It went from like paleo to low carb paleo to keto to then carnivore started getting popular in the underground. And it gets to a point where you can't get really any more restricted than just eating meat, salt, water, eggs, dairy, things like that. And there were periods of time where I thought I am the healthiest I could possibly be. Like, there's nothing I could be doing that's healthier right now. I'm fit, I'm active, I do not eat carbohydrates. Why am I insulin resistant? Why is my morning blood sugar high, which I now know to be the dawn phenomenon? And I was baffled. And I have probably said this before, so sorry if I've said this before and you've heard me say it before. But at the time, I was following a lot of people that were low carb influencers in the space. I had a lot of colleagues who were low carb, and I was just very immersed in that world. And two women come to mind, but one specifically who got pregnant around the same time, and they were both very low carb. I knew that they were very low carb, like I'm talking low. And they both got gestational diabetes while they were pregnant. And I think that was the first. There was many dominoes that got me my wheels spinning. I'm the type of person that's a thinker and I'm always observing patterns. And so I don't think it was maybe the first domino that I had seen fall, but it definitely was one that got my attention because I was thinking, if carbs cause diabetes, if carbs cause insulin resistance, unless both these women are lying about being low carb, there is something more going on here. And there were other factors, there were other things going on, other dominoes or red flags that started getting my wheels spinning, but that was a big one for me because it just didn't make any sense. It was like, how can women who are eating so low carbs get gestational diabetes? Does not make sense. So, what really is the problem when it comes to insulin resistance? And so, we're going to talk a little bit about insulin resistance. Now, keep in mind what I said. Blood sugar dysregulation is not always insulin resistance. You have to confirm both. So if you're someone that uses a continuous glucose monitor, I think they're great tools. I personally, it makes me a little uneasy to live my life by data, always hooked up to these devices. It's a little too AI for me. But I think these tools can be very helpful in the short term, especially if you're really just struggling. Like you're waking up a lot at night, you're feeling very dysregulated, you can't get a handle on your nervous system, you're always feeling really hyper stressed, shaky, the typical, even just like hypoglycemia symptoms. I think a continuous glucose monitor used for a set period of time, I'm talking a whole cycle. So I like to start day 1 or maybe like day 27 of the cycle if you have a 28-day cycle and go a full cycle. But it's really cool when you can do day 1 of the cycle all the way to the end of the cycle and just see the whole thing and what your patterns are. And if you can do 2 full cycles, it's very helpful because you can see that, okay, this cycle and this cycle are very similar in my patterns. And so that shows me that's at certain types of times of my cycle, that's what's happening with my blood sugar. But is that necessary? No. You can also use a blood glucose monitor, which they tend to be a little bit more accurate. Continuous glucose monitors test the interstitial fluid, whereas blood glucose monitors test the blood glucose. So they're both considered accurate, but they can be different. And so it's just important to keep that in mind. But you always want to run that against a fasting insulin and a fasting leptin because that can tell you a little bit bigger of a picture. But if you have blood sugar dysregulation without having high insulin, then you've probably got a stress issue. Keep in mind that glucocorticoids or glucose hormones, corticoids are hormones, glucose movers are very good at moving glucose and mobilizing glucose when under duress or when in a state of need. And so if you are constantly having blood sugar issues, it's usually stress related. And when I say stress, like physiological stress is a physiological process and a response to a stimuli. We don't always have to respond physiologically the same way. I think sometimes people think of stress differently, like stress is, I'm stressed or stressors, but everybody responds to different stimuli or challenges placed upon the body in a different way. Some people are very resilient, right? And that's the goal with anything in health is building a type of adaptability and a resilience to your environment and to any type of stimuli or challenges that are placed upon the body. But if you're somebody that truly can't manage your blood sugar well and it's not insulin resistance related or leptin resistance related, it can be a lack of movement. It can be stress related, like I mentioned before. Cortisol, adrenaline are all glucose movers. You also have factors like mineral imbalances or mineral depletion, specifically things like potassium and magnesium, which really help regulate your body's ability to uptake glucose. Thyroid is a big one. So if you are hypothyroid, whether that be clinically or functionally, you can have a problem with uptake of glucose and it will remain high in the blood, or you'll have these kind of spikes high and low. Also, gut imbalances are a big one. These kind of underlying infections, whether it be yeast or bacterial overgrowths, they can also cause glucose to be absorbed in a kind of a sporadic way, very quickly or very slowly, just depending on what you're dealing with. So, those are factors that I look at a lot more when there's blood sugar dysregulation. And then, of course, nervous system patterns. If somebody is a very reactive person, they're always jumping into a state of fight or flight, or they're always very hyper vigilant, perfectionist, type A, all of that can also really have an impact on your stress load and also your blood glucose response. If you think of your blood glucose as the sweetness of life, it's the literal sweetness within your bloodstream, and having a receptivity to sweetness. I think a lot of women, when you hear it put that way on a more energetic level, a lot of us are so hardened. We're so resistant. That sweet part of the feminine nature is shut down. She's small. She's starving. She's undernourished. And so I think that energetically, it could be a huge part of it as well, is where are you resisting sweetness? Are you closed off to sweetness? Have you feel like you lost your sweetness? Do you need to return to your sweetness? Those are big factors as well. Now, diving into more insulin resistance and leptin resistance, I want you to keep in mind a few things. So I'm going to hit on a few points. The liver can store a good amount of glycogen. And the liver's main job, or one of its many main jobs, is to keep us fueled in times of fasting or famine. And so the liver can store up enough glycogen to release it slowly into the bloodstream to the organs and tissues that need it the most. We also have muscle glycogen, and the muscles have a huge capacity to store up glycogen, way more than the liver. And glycogen, if you don't know what glycogen is, it's a storage form of glucose. Now, the muscles don't release it into the bloodstream quite like the liver does. The muscles keep it for themselves. They're a little selfish in that way because they are survival tissues. And so if you needed to run away, for example, if you needed to in fight or flight, you need to fight or you needed to flee, you need some quick firing fuel source in your muscles so your muscles have the energy to do what they need to do. And so that's why you store glycogen in your muscle tissue versus your liver tissue. It's to make sure that the liver is fueled for all of its processes because it often attaches glucuronic acid, which is a glucose acid, to, or sugar acid, I should say. Glucose acid is a little oversimplistic, but a sugar acid to certain toxins, certain waste products, so that they become neutralized, if you want to simplify it that way, and can be carried out of the body. Estrogen is one of those things. So estrogen is usually attached to a sugar acid, glucuronic acid, and this is why in gut tests, like the GI map, you test for beta glucuronidase, which is an enzyme that detaches the estrogen from the sugar acid and which kind of reactivates estrogen's power, and it can be reabsorbed and reutilized by the body. And this is why you often see a lot of women struggling if they have gut imbalances with these quote unquote estrogen dominance symptoms, because they are reactivating and reabsorbing the estrogen in their gut. And it's because they're actually the enzymes that these bacteria are making in their estrobolome or their microbolome is detaching that sugar acid. So that's why sugar is so important for the liver. It uses it for many different metabolic processes, not just making sure our tissues remain fueled. Now, in a very metabolically flexible body, after your liver runs out of glucose, it doesn't completely run out. It's not like completely empty. It saves enough to survive. But let's say, for analogy's sake, that once your liver runs out completely for pushing it into the bloodstream for other tissues, that's when we are able to start to burn a different type of energy, which is fat, right? And so this is where fats begin to be released into the bloodstream, usually stored fats, right? Free fatty acids. And when we're metabolically flexible, this is fine because we can burn fats for fuel or sugar for fuel or glucose for fuel. It's great for our body to be able to use both. There are some tissues in the body that can use both, but there are many tissues in the body that prefer one or the other. So for a great example of this is there's certain areas of the brain can only use glucose. And then survival areas of the brain, like to stay alive, can use both glucose and ketones or fats. And then muscles, for example, when they're active, when they're being used, they like to burn sugar and they need to burn sugar because they need that quick firing energy. When muscles are at rest, they actually love to consume fat. So it just depends on the tissue and then even like how the tissue is being used. But certain cells really like sugar and certain cells really like fats, and then some are a little bit more flexible. And so in a healthy metabolism, you're going to have this effortless ability to switch back and forth. So let's say, for example, you are starting to get a little bit hungry and you need to eat your meal, but you don't immediately jump into a place of hunger where you go from 0 to 100 of I need food now or I'm going to just rip someone's head off. And certain times of the cycle, we will be a little bit more prone to that for certain reasons that I'll dive into in a moment. But we should be able to say, like, I'm hungry, but I'm okay because what's happening? Well, we're tapping into our fat storage. And of course, that depends on our metabolic flexibility. If we have enough body fat, right, the less body fat we have as women, there does seem to be a threshold with every single woman where too low of body fat now starts to just throw the body into a stress state anytime it starts to get hungry or need fuel, because our body likes to maintain a certain body fat percentage for our fertility and our hormones. And if we got pregnant, we would want to be able to survive a famine and be able to feed that baby, not only grow the baby, but also be able to take care of the baby once it's born. There's aspects to our biology that are different in that regard. But right now, what we're dealing with is a population that doesn't really burn fat well and doesn't really burn glucose. Both have their value, right? I'm sure you can see that just from a survival perspective is if you can burn glucose, that really helps you produce a certain amount of electrons. There's benefits to burning glucose. There's also benefits to being able to burn fat, mostly survival benefits, but also you create a different amount of electrons when you are not using the Krebs cycle for fuel. There's aspects to both, benefits to both. One is not better than the other. And that's where these two camps are trying to land. I think some people in the pro-metabolic space have gotten distracted by saying it's only about burning sugar, and if you don't burn sugar, it's bad. And then people in the more like carnivore keto space are like, it's all about burning fat, and ketones give you superpowers, and if you burn glucose, you're a little peon. It's either or. You really want that metabolic flexibility. And the question is always, what gets us to that metabolic flexibility the best way? And extremes often don't, because they don't get to the root of the issue. It's catering to a body that is dysregulated versus actually getting to the root of why something is happening. And so a lot of people are in a state where they're not really burning glucose, not really burning fat. And it's for a multitude of reasons, right? We grew up eating plastic fats, industrial seed oils, at least most of us did. We have spent a lot of time being exposed to a lot of nasty shit. And then on top of it, we now sit in front of screens all day. We're incredibly lonely. We're not connected. We're unhappy. There's negative things being thrown at us in all which directions. There's many layers to it. You add the heavy metals, you add the estrogens, the environmental pollutants. You add in all the layers of crap that we're dealing with. And it's, of course, we are not using our fuel because we're not using our bodies as they were intended to be used. There's many aspects of society right now that are so far from nature, it makes sense. And that's more of the esoteric, the overarching view. But sometimes that's very helpful to zoom out and just say, we don't move as much. We don't spend as much time outside. We don't do things that bring us joy. We don't pursue our creativity and our art. We don't eat foods that we grew ourselves or that our neighbor grew. We don't eat animals that were loved and cared for. Everything's so broken. So, of course, our bodies are starting to show signs of that. But if I can pinpoint a few things that probably are making the most impact right now, it's definitely blue light. We're sitting in front of screens more than ever. And if we're not sitting in front of our computer screen for work, then we're sitting in front of our phone or our TV. There's just so much unnatural light exposure, and it's not being balanced out by natural light exposure outside. We're not spending a huge amount of time outside anymore. It's flip-flopped, whereas before we would go outside in the morning and we spend all day outside and then we would come inside in the evening to be safe and warm and cozy. Now it's the opposite. And another big factor is our sedentary lifestyle. I talked about exercise in Nourish Circle this month because it is something that I feel like there was a period of time for a while where people were over-exercising and under-eating. And I feel like that was concentrated around like 2018, 2019, and 2020. And then you see this big shift when COVID happened and everything got shut down, gyms got closed, like people had to slow down. They were forced to slow down and regroup for a second. And the pace of life changed. Everything changed. For a lot of people, they were pushing their bodies so hard. They were in that constant toxic state of striving where they just collapsed. And the rest was necessary. I will acknowledge that the rest was necessary. I don't think that was a bad thing for many of us to do, is just slow the heck down for a second. But I think we're at a point now, we're at this turning point where it's 4 years later, right? It's almost been 5 years, which is crazy because I feel like most of us just froze then and we haven't aged since. We feel like mentally we're still stuck there. It's taken a lot of work to move ourselves out of that fear and move ourselves out of that dysregulation and get to a place where we have a clear path moving forward. But a lot of us got to this place where we stopped moving as much and then we never started again. And so now there is a sedentary problem. And there was always a sedentary problem in the sense that people would go to the gym and they would smash weights or they would do cardio, but they would never really move. And so one of the things that I mentioned in this month's Nourish Circle was the idea of really setting a movement foundation of walking, not necessarily being really strict about you need to have 10,000 steps a day, but really making it a priority to get moving, get walking, and doing that in a way that fits your lifestyle. And we talked about some tips and tricks to do that, but also these movement snacks or exercise snacks that are actually what they're referred to in the research. But this idea of if you just do small bits of exercise throughout the day, it can make big results, sometimes even more so than just going to the gym for 45 minutes and doing a workout, but actually really implementing movement throughout your day and ways to move. It is exponentially healthy, not only for so many systems of the body, but also your metabolism, your ability to utilize fuel. And we had the blue light, not getting outside, which are together, the sedentary lifestyle. Of course, PUFAs and polyunsaturated fats are a problem, but I think people are taking this too dang far now, where it's like, you can never eat an avocado or you can't eat nuts anymore, or nut butters are just never have them. And do we really think that like having some nut butter is the problem? No, it's not the problem. And I think a lot of people will say, when I was eating nut butters, I was fine. And then when I stopped eating them, that's when the problems began. And it's because for a lot of people, they actually replaced whole food fat. Instead of eating, let's say, avocado oil, you had a whole avocado. Or instead of eating a seed oil, you ate a whole seed. Or instead of eating a nut oil, not that there's really nut oils, but you're, just for analogy's sake, you were eating whole nuts or nut butters. And so now we've swung in the opposite direction, but The unsaturated fats that are the problem, the industrial seed oils, they are stored in our tissue, especially if we are overweight and we got overweight when we were consuming those foods. Our body really likes to prioritize the use of saturated fats first and will put unsaturated fats in storage just because it doesn't need to use as much unsaturated fats as it does saturated. And then we also have heavy metal exposure. We just have so many heavy metal exposures, and iron fortification is just one of many. But copper, we have lots of cadmium, nickel, just these aluminum coming from from the sky, from just anything really broadened by the Industrial Revolution brought in a lot of heavy metals. And then also people have really sporadic eating schedules. I think that's a big one that can be a problem. They just eat when they're hungry, or one day they'll eat breakfast at 8 a.m., one day they'll eat breakfast at 11 a.m., one day they'll eat breakfast at 7 a.m. There's this like sporadic eating schedule taking place, and that's not as common, I think, for people that are more nutritionally aware, but I think it can be a really big problem for regulating leptin, and that will therefore impact insulin. We also have poor sleep. Sleep is an epidemic right now, and it is a problem because sleep absolutely impacts our insulin sensitivity, our leptin, our ability to use fuel. And it also impacts all those other things where it impacts our body's ability to detoxify heavy metals, all of it. And so it can be a problem. I already mentioned leptin resistance as a big driving factor of insulin resistance. Usually leptin resistance will come first. And leptin resistance is really caused, I mean, it's complex. I could probably do a whole episode on it, but we can narrow it down to light and just our circadian rhythms and our rhythms as a whole, and creating these kind of consistent rhythms in our life can be a big factor. There are other factors, but that is one of the big ones. And then nutrient deficiencies, especially deficiencies in potassium and magnesium. And I'm actually seeing this become more and more common lately because all of the really high sodium electrolyte powders that are really popular these days are causing people to displace their potassium that's already low. And so if you're somebody that feels like you are losing energy, or your ability to tolerate carbohydrates is reducing from using electrolyte powders, really look at the sodium to potassium ratio. A lot of them have very little potassium in relation to sodium, and a lot of women are already really struggling with low potassium. Then you add in the factor that women need more potassium, especially in the second half of the cycle, because potassium can cause progesterone can cause excretion of potassium, and you have this kind of recipe for disaster. So really all of that can culminate and lead us to not using our fuel. And then if we add in the layer of carb needs do shift tremendously based on the time of year, the location that we live in. If we live in a very cold, dark place, carbs might not actually, especially carbs that are imported from across the world, may not be our best option for fuel. And then activity level, right? Like somebody that is super active doesn't need as much carbohydrate as someone that is super sedentary. It just makes sense. If you're strength training or you're doing some type of conditioning or some type of endurance training, your needs for carbohydrates absolutely increases because you have that need for quick firing fuel. And if you are trying to do something like build muscle, you absolutely need carbohydrate to do. There just becomes a limit to where if you are using solely fat as fuel, you are not going to see muscle growth as when you're using carbohydrates. But sun exposure and genetics will also play a role, right? If you're somebody that hails from a very dark, cold place, and only 2 generations ago, they moved from that dark, cold place, and now you're here, maybe your needs for carbohydrates are much lower. I definitely see some people have a lower need for carbohydrates and a higher need for fat. And then I definitely see people that thrive on a lower amount of fat and a higher amount of carbohydrate, keeping the protein constant. But it just really depends on the person and the needs. And you really only know when you experiment. Until then, no one can really tell you what's right for you, but you don't know until you try. And so also, because most of you are female, And if you have physiology that is female or you're biologically female, you do have shifts in the metabolism that happen mid-cycle. So right now there's this big, I don't want to say misconception because I've used this term as well and it's technically correct, but this idea that you're very estrogen dominant in the first half of your cycle. And then once you ovulate, then you're very progesterone dominant in the second half of your cycle. And it's interesting because it's a little misleading, especially a lot of the cycle graphs that are floating around out there, especially in the hormone space, the cycle syncing space, this idea that your estrogen is super, super high in the first half of the cycle, and estrogen is the female hormone, and then progesterone comes in, it's also equally the female hormone. But when you look at the amount of estrogen that we create and use compared to progesterone, it is minuscule amounts of estrogen are needed to bring ovulation to fruition. It's a very controlled burn. And the first half of the cycle is really, although it is technically estrogen dominant because estrogen is higher in relationship to progesterone, it's not like excessively high. So this idea that you have so much estrogen at play in the first half of the cycle, and so therefore you only burn fat as fuel, it's not completely correct. You definitely use fat as fuel a little bit better in the first half of the cycle because you are not producing as much progesterone. Once progesterone comes into the picture, this is why you crave more sweets in the second half of the cycle if you're not eating enough carbohydrate. Cravings are tools to point us in the right direction of what our body is asking for. It's not, if we crave Oreos, I must need an Oreo. It's, okay, I'm craving sugar, I'm craving starch, I'm craving calorically rich foods. What does my body need? Maybe I need to up my calories. Maybe I need a little bit more carbohydrates in my diet. Those are the types of things that our cravings are like an oracle, but they aren't telling us precisely what to do about it. And it's important to keep that in mind. But our cravings go up for carbohydrate in the second half of the cycle because we need them. And our production of progesterone increases our carbohydrate usage and changes our metabolism into the utilization of more carbohydrates because it's thyroid stimulatory. The progesterone is stimulating the thyroid, and so therefore the thyroid is going to increase the metabolism as a whole, which is going to slightly increase your need for fuel. And if you understand that the luteal phase is really just a pre-pregnancy preparation phase and the shifts of the metabolism are reflecting this like slow, gradual rise into a possible pregnancy, then it makes more sense. But to be honest, I think the question is always, okay, all that information is cool and it's cool to know about my body, but what do I do about it? And I totally understand. And I'm going to sound like a broken record here, but really, you do need to be nourished. And what I mean by that is most people have never just eaten consistently and eaten sensibly and eaten in a balanced way. It's always from extreme to extreme, these sporadic eating where like you skip breakfast and then you eat at 11 and then you one day have breakfast at 8. And I think feminine consistency is very different than this masculine idea of consistency, where it's like this idea of discipline, and I must do everything the same rigid way in the same rigid structure and schedule each and every day. That's not what your body needs, but it is a rhythm and a dance, and consistency can look different every day while still providing the body the same things. And your eating schedule, I don't even like to use the word schedule, but I'm going to use it here, is a great way to create consistency in your appetite, your hunger, and those hormones that drive hunger, like ghrelin, like leptin. And so if you're trying to create a sense of normalcy there and bring balance back to the hormones, it makes sense to use your food to communicate that to your body. So it's a tool. And what I would say is if you're not someone that has ever just eaten 3 meals a day that contains protein, carb, fat, some fiber that works for you, if fiber works for you, try that first and just see and make sure you're eating overall enough calories. Some women need that extra 4th meal. They do need to eat every 3 to 4 hours because right now their liver cannot store up enough glycogen. They're not metabolically flexible enough to get there. But the goal is to get to a point where you are adaptable, you are resilient, and you can handle 5 hours between meals and eat 3 meals a day or 3 meals and a snack a day and get in all your calories at that point. And everyone's a little different, and everyone needs a little bit of a different food frequency. There's no perfect way to do it. But that's to say is just start there. Start with some consistency. Make sure you're eating enough and make sure you're eating balanced every time you eat. And then keep meal density in mind as well. One of the things that I see women focus on is they're so heavily focused on the calories or what to restrict that they forget that certain types of foods work better for them than others. For example, you can take a smoothie and you can take a pot roast with mashed potatoes, and you can have the same amount of calories, right? Same amount of macros. Even the macro breakdown, the protein, carbs, and fats are the exact same. But I think most of you would agree, if you're listening, that a pot roast with mashed potatoes hits very different than a smoothie with fruit and milk and protein powder, for example. And I'm not saying that either one is bad, but what I'm saying is keep your meal density in mind. If you are someone that really needs a type of density to what I call anchor your blood sugar and anchor your whole system, you need to honor that, or you're going to be on a roller coaster all day long. Like, I know for me personally, if I had a smoothie for breakfast, I would be on a roller coaster all day long. It's not dense enough for me. It's not woman enough for me. You know what I mean? Like, I'm a grown woman and I need to eat, especially in the morning. Another thing that you can really focus on is your light. And I know a lot of people always focus on what to remove. Okay, where can I remove blue light or block blue light? And that's helpful, right? If you can exchange your light bulbs. The simple tips that I've done to just limit my light exposure is I use blue blocking glasses if I'm using any devices at night, and I also put the red tint. You can just Google like how to put a red tint on your devices at night. I try to not do devices at night, so I have like this mental cutoff where after 8 I read instead of go on my iPad. Do I always follow it? No, but I try to most nights. And I also have exchanged not every light bulb in the house. I live in an RV, so it's not that many light bulbs, but the light bulbs that we use in the evening I replace with the block blue light bulbs. So they have these amber tinted good night light bulbs. Love those things. They're just so soothing. And then on the TVs, if we were going to watch a movie or do something like that, I actually ordered Shop Waken, WAKN, has these really cool TV, like amber tinted TV screen things that you can order, and they'll make them custom to the size of your TVs. And it's just like this amber film that you bungee cord to your TV. It's really dope. And those are just the 3 things that I've done. And I don't really care about anything else. And the rest of it is focused on what can I get in. So can I get outside when I wake up in the morning? Yes. Can I do some of my work outside? Yes. Can I go for a walk in the sun? Yes. Can I take the dog to the park in the sun? Yes. Can I sit outside during sunset? Yes. Those are things that I can do to really get some good light exposure on my eyes and my skin. Another thing that you can do that's really popular, and I know it's this is very popular in the quantum space because pinkies up, quantum healing is in, but eating outside. It's a way to get light inside, orient your body to its environment, and also just have a little bit of relaxation while you eat. Eating in front of the TV or a screen is like one of the worst habits, but I know we all do it sometimes. And sometimes it's just like a dirty little pleasure to just sit there and watch TV and eat. And I'm not taking away all your dirty little pleasures, but what I'm saying is, can you do it 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10? It can be a really great habit, especially if you're struggling with leptin resistance or insulin resistance. And protein, huge one. Anchor your protein in the morning. I know eating breakfast is a continually very controversial topic. But if you're someone that's very motivated and dedicated to fast, I would encourage you to fast in the evening. Cut your meals off early and fast from earlier on in the evening to an earlier time in the morning. And the reason for this is it's better to eat most of your calories while the sun is out than to eat most of your calories while the sun is going down. I call this day loading or front loading your calories. It's a really good idea to eat a majority of the food that you're going to eat in the day during the day and not during the evening. And make sure that first meal has a good amount of protein, at least over 30 grams. And when it comes to food, just don't graze. It's okay to have a snack, especially if it's a balanced snack, if you absolutely need it, but don't be grazing all day. If you have children too, I see moms do this a lot where their kids aren't going to finish their whole plate of food and there's like a little grape left and a little bite of sandwich and a few little crackers, and they're just like, I don't want to waste it, so I'm going to eat it. And that's like the worst habit. Just throw it away. Don't eat it. Make yourself something balanced when it's time to eat, but don't just like snack to snack. And especially if you're someone that's been struggling with this stuff, even some of the practices in the pro-metabolic space are not good for you. Like, for example, people always having a gummy all the time, gummy that's made of fruit juice or lemonade, or having these hot chocolates or these kind of more sugar bomb type snacks. I will never demonize sugar. I think having a good amount of sugar in the diet, especially in a nutrient-dense diet, is beneficial, healthy even, metabolically stimulating, and just satiating, and also just good for the soul. But if you're somebody that's struggling specifically with insulin resistance, or you're struggling with leptin resistance, it's better to try to space your meals out as far as you can go. And when you do eat, you want something to be a little bit more dense, a little bit more nutritious, and not so light. And what I would consider light is like a smoothie or a bone broth hot chocolate or something like that. Usually it doesn't work too well. I'm not saying all the time, because there's, again, always nuance, but that's something that I try to bring up. And then another thing would be to stop using so many liquid fats and oils, or even concentrated fats and oils. Like, I'm talking about butter and tallow and coconut oil. Stop loading up. If you want fats, have fatty meat, have whole fats like avocado, not avocado oil, olives, not just olive oil. Of course, use the amount of fats and oils that you need to cook with, but that should not be your main source of fuel. And so many people are adding so many grams of fat to their meals without even really realizing it or recognizing it. And it can actually start to interfere with your body's ability to use glucose. Fat is not bad. Fat is nourishing. It's good for you, but you don't need to load up excessively on fat. You'll have a little bit more leniency with this if you're super active or you're someone that's a little bit more on the leaner side. But if you're somebody that's insulin resistant and you're especially struggling with your weight, be a little bit more mindful about where you're getting your fats from and try to choose whole food fats. Again, fats are not bad. Don't cut them out. But if you're globbing huge amounts of butter in your scrambled eggs in the morning, that could be a part of your problem. Another habit that is just proving to be very helpful in blood glucose control is combining non-starchy vegetables with your starches. What this would look like on a practical level and how I implement it is when I'm making something like, let's say, mashed potatoes, I will boil the potatoes, and then I will, towards the end of the potatoes being done, throw in some broccoli. You can use frozen broccoli, you can use fresh broccoli, and I'll wait until the broccoli is really soft and the potatoes are really soft, strain them, and then mash them together. You can use cauliflower as well. But the habit of adding a non-starchy vegetable to a starch. Or another example of this would be if you're going to have pasta, have a little side salad with it. These are things that traditional cuisine has implemented for so long. It's crazy. But again, we're so far from our traditional cuisine. We're so far from nature that we forget these practices, and we have to remember to implement them. So if you're somebody that's insulin resistant, just try to cut down on the starch a little bit, but more so try to combine your starches with some non-starchy veg. It can be very helpful. And then some more quick fixes or some more add-ons that can be very helpful would be anything that contains lactic acid. So lactic acid producing bacteria like lactobacillus. That would be like sauerkraut or lactoferments or even kombucha, things like that. or vinegars like apple cider vinegar, red wine vinegar, white wine vinegar, rice vinegar, any kind of vinegar can be very helpful in kind of modulating the blood glucose spike, the blood glucose response, and over time sensitizing your body to insulin. And because it's shifting the microbiome, that's really what it's doing, is it's having an impact on the microbiota there. And so it's shifting your gut's response. Bitters are another one. If you are someone that you like to use vinegar, but you want a little bit more of a punch, bitters are very liver supportive, right? And so they really can help regulate the glucose response as well. And then some other really promising compounds that just again and again in the research, like always seem to have an impact, but everyone's a little different. So you might try bitters and be like, they don't really impact my blood sugar all that much, or vinegar doesn't really work for me, but you just have to try different things. And these are some work for people, some don't. One of them is green tea. You can use regular green tea or you can use matcha, but they seem to have a very glucose regulating effect for a lot of people. Cinnamon is another one. Lemon peel specifically, but you can also do a little lemon juice, like think warm water with lemon and cinnamon. You can also think of like ginger or any type of bitter herb like dandelion can be a good one as well. So those can be things that you steep into a tea. I know some people really prefer to do tinctures. They want something simple, but I usually recommend a warm tea, herbal tea sipped with meals or sipped right before meals. All of those can work together to be very helpful. But for most people, it's actually just the basics. Time and time again shows us that it's always going back to the basics. Consistent eating, getting enough protein, anchoring your blood sugar in the morning with breakfast within an hour or so of waking, anchoring your meals on a consistent basis throughout the day, focusing on your light exposure, your outside time exposure, just exercising, being less sedentary. All of that over time, those are not quick fixes, but those are really what's going to resolve the issue over time. It's about changing your lifestyle, changing your habits, one step at a time, and that's what's going to get you there the quickest. Very rarely is it swinging from extreme to extreme. You're always going to find yourself on the hunt for something more. And it's never going to lead you to where you're really trying to go, which you're trying to get to a place where you are happy and your habits make you happy and fill you with joy and pleasure. There's something that you enjoy doing on a day-to-day basis because that's what's going to actually make it sustainable for you. So I hope that you enjoyed this episode on blood sugar and insulin resistance. All these concepts have been around in the Jessica Ash wellness community for quite some time. So if you've been around for a while, these are probably not new to you, but oldies are goodies, and it's always good to go over the basics. So I like to make sure I hit on them from time to time. Wait, before you go, I just want to let you know that I want your questions, topics, and guest requests. I rely on your feedback so much so I can create content that is inspired by you. Make sure to visit the form in the show notes to submit any questions you'd like me to feature in coming episodes. I want to hear from you. And if any links or resources were discussed today, they're included in the show notes, which are also linked in the description box below. And if you enjoyed the episode and want to support the podcast, please share about it with others, share about it on social media, or like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you want to engage about this episode or want to deep dive into my process, follow me on Instagram at Jessica Ash Wellness. And if you want to be in on all the Jaw secrets, sign up for my Sunday tea email in the show notes. Thanks for gracing me with your presence, and I'll see you soon. Stay nourished.